Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the Program Officer for Education, Leadership, and Engagement here at Community Progress. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., and I encourage you to share your name and where you're signing in from in the chat. Community Progress webinars equip participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's webinar, we're joined by Liz Kozub, an Associate Director of Technical Assistance at the Center for Community Progress, and Matt Kreis, the General Counsel at the Center for Community Progress. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A box below. We will share presentation slides and a video recording of today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at jzimmerman@communityprogress.org. And with that, I will turn it over to Liz.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. My camera's turning on. Let's see. There we go. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's conversation on delinquent property tax enforcement. We really appreciate you being here today. And so for those of you that are kind of frequent flyers to Community Progress's webinar, or this is your first time joining us, I'm sure there's likely a challenge with vacant properties that are stuck in some condition in your community that are causing harm, and you're trying to figure out what to do with it and how can we make them unstuck and bring them back into productive use. And likely through your research and your practices and conversations locally, you've come across the really important issue of delinquent taxes, and particularly delinquent property tax enforcement. So we know that delinquent property tax enforcement can be one of local government's strongest legal tools to address the issue of vacant and abandoned properties that are stuck in a deteriorating condition. And we also know when the delinquent property tax enforcement system, or just the whole property tax enforcement system, is designed poorly, it can often become one of the biggest contributing factors that is causing some of the vacancy challenges in your community. We're gonna, unpack that in today's conversation. And just one last introductory note that delinquent property tax enforcement is legislated at the state level, and it looks different in all 50 states. And within those states, it could look different from county to county and city to city. So it's really important to understand the nuances within the jurisdiction that you're working in, to understand what laws are applied, and then also how that policy is put into practice in the different processes that affect your particular jurisdiction. So remember working prior to coming to Community Progress in Allegheny County, thinking about starting up a land bank and really just sketching out the full process of the delinquent tax foreclosure system in that county. And it can be really tricky. It's nuanced, it can be complicated, but it's also hugely important as we're thinking about ways that we can improve the conditions of our community. So just want to appreciate you all and taking the time to dig a little deeper with us today. All right, there we go. So as we're going into this conversation, and especially as my colleague Matt talks about reform a little later on in the presentation, it's really important to keep top of mind why we're trying to address these vacant properties and communities, and specifically the individuals that are most impacted by the harms of vacant properties. So we know that the tax enforcement system has had disparate impacts in communities across the country, particularly Black communities and communities that are lower income. And so as we're thinking about new approaches and just talking about the tax sale system in general, it's really important that it's driven by local context and the shared experience and lived experience of people within those communities that have high rates of vacancy. So for today's conversation, I'm going to keep the agenda pretty simple. First, we're going to talk about why do we care about delinquent tax enforcement from a higher level. We'll then dig a little deeper into what is it? What are the key terms? What is the processes? And then I'll turn it over to my colleague Matt to talk about what reform is possible and how that could look within your jurisdiction if that's something that you're interested in. Excuse me. I wanted to thank my colleagues, Matt, for putting a good bulk of this presentation together in support of our VAT Academy last year, and my colleague, Kim Graziani, who is the lead author of our seminal publication on delinquent tax enforcement called Evaluating Your Delinquent Tax Enforcement System. And a lot of the information, especially the infographics, are pulled from that really, really informative report. So, why do we care? I'm sure you all care, which is why you're here today, which is great. We noticed in the registration and just seeing some of the chats come through, a good bulk of you come from local government. And as we know, taxes are hugely important to funding the essential services that local governments are charged with delivering to their constituents and their citizens. So, what we know is that property taxes fund about 30% of all local government revenues, and they contribute to 85% of locally controlled revenues. So, hugely important in terms of being able to fund essential services that local governments are responsible for, whether that be road, public infrastructure, various items. And they're also hugely important for funding the services that folks look to when they're looking to purchase a home in a community or move to a community, like parks, like community centers, various amenities that we think of when we think of vibrant, healthy neighborhoods. So property taxes are important. I think we can all have agreed to that. Excuse me. But the way that we have collected those taxes in our country has been problematic in many ways, from the ways that properties have been assessed, to the lack of outreach about tax delinquency, to minimal relief programs or circuit breakers, catching people earlier in the process so their delinquency amount doesn't pile up, whether that's bringing occupied properties to tax sale for just a few $100s and then selling those properties to out-of-state investors that have exorbitant fees that folks have to pay back in order to redeem their properties or hold on to it, or they just transfer them to new owners that have no buy-in into the community. So the tax sale system has caused a lot of harm in communities, and especially Black communities across the country and low-income communities as well. It's been a deeply kind of racist system in many places. There's a lot of great research out there that kind of talks about how this has played out over, the past century, and especially Andrew Carl, who's done a lot of research. If you were able to attend our National Land Bank Summit just last month, presented on his findings from the Black Tax book that he authored, and kind of the disparate impacts of property tax sale system in Black communities, especially the influx of tax lien investors and the harm that was causing a lot of communities. So at Community Progress, we feel pretty strongly that there needs to be different approaches and considerations for properties that are occupied versus those that are vacant. We're going to talk about this as we move through today's conversation, but obviously the most important reason being the human and ethical concerns of not wanting to displace people from their homes. But also, we don't want to create a system where people are being displaced and then that property becomes vacant. And then it continues to fuel the deterioration and destabilization that we're seeing in a lot of neighborhoods across the country. All right. So delinquent taxes are often the first and very clear warning sign that there's an issue within a property, that somebody's either facing financial hardship or that the owner has walked away and has no potential interest in the property moving forward. We like to say that time is the worst enemy of a vacant property. The longer a property sits and that it's vacant, the more harm it causes to communities, the more of a destabilizing effect it has on the block and in the neighborhood, and the more costly it comes to address that property. So we've all heard in our communities stories of, copper pipes being stolen, of windows being broken. There might be water damage that starts off small, but then has a significant impact. Eventually, those repair costs become really exorbitant and the property becomes unsalvageable. Local government might have to step in to demolish the property, and then we're left with a vacant lot that continues to need some type of maintenance and public investment or other type of investment to keep it cleared and free of rodents and all of that. So I have no doubt that everybody on the call has experience in seeing some of this, but importantly, it also really is destructive in terms of the fabric of a community, in terms of its infrastructure, its culture, social connections that exist. So, what can we do to prevent that lapse of time and to prevent properties from getting kind of stuck in the system? And first is just understanding why properties are stuck in that state of deterioration where no one's responsible for it. We know that there are issues with conditions. We've heard a lot of stories of family members having a sentimental tie to a property and not wanting to give it up for whatever reason. But the most common reason is that a property remains stuck, especially in weaker market, because it is underwater in debt in some way, as illustrated on your screen. So it's that the market value, and again, market value, excuse me, just gonna take a sip of water. Sorry, the kids back at school and daycare cold season has started in my house. Um, so the market value is the amount of money that somebody is willing to pay for that property. It's not the assessed value, which often is not a good indicator of how much a property is worth to somebody, what they will pay for it. So it's that the market value is less than the total amount of debt that is owed on the property, as illustrated on your screen. So we pose the question of like, would you buy this property? Would you buy this property in this state? Also, if it needs an additional $20,000 in repair work. And the answer is probably not. And it's likely that this property will continue to sit and be stuck and deteriorate and continue to accumulate taxes and debts on the property. So, what we can do to prevent the lapse of time and then just the accumulation of delinquent taxes and abatement costs that local governments might be putting in is find a way to swiftly transfer that vacant tax delinquent property to new ownership. We've found this to be the most effective way in addressing these vacant properties that are causing significant harm, putting it in the hands of somebody that's responsible. And importantly, the delinquent tax foreclosure system is a legal mechanism that local governments can leverage to do just that, to compel the transfer of these properties to new owners. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what it is. What are we talking about when we say delinquent tax enforcement? We'll start by covering some of the basic terms. The property tax sales system. That is the full system of property taxation, from the valuation to the assessment to the bills that go out and when they're due, and then ultimately the collection of those taxes and the enforcement. When we talk about delinquent property tax enforcement, that's what we're talking about when we're thinking about the legal tools to address the vacant and abandoned properties. This stage is what happens at the very end of the property tax sale system. It's that last enforcement mechanism. A tax lien. Tax lien is a priority lien. It's above other liens like mortgages, and it is what can be used to secure the payment of the taxes. And the redemption period is the time in which the owner, any interested parties like a mortgage holder or somebody else that has a lien on the properties, can pay back that lien and the amount that's due, municipal debts that is due, to prevent that property from being lost. All right. So those are the basic terms. We'll talk about the components of the tax sale system. So the first is there's kind of 6 components here. And the first is determining the value of the property, so the assessment of the property, and then establishing that tax rate, so the millage rate that's going to be imposed against the property. Next, we're going to determine if the property is actually subject to property taxes. In a lot of jurisdictions, if a property is owned by a nonprofit or an entity with a specific tax designation, they may not have to pay property taxes. That's not kind of an across the board standard. It varies state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but determining like what is the total number of properties that are taxable in our jurisdiction. Next is applying any type of relief or programs like a homestead exemption on the property, and then ultimately determining what that tax bill is for that particular property. Then we collect the taxes after we send out the bills. And then if it's delinquent for a certain period of time, there's some type of enforcement mechanism. So again, when we're talking about addressing vacant and abandoned properties, we're really interested in that enforcement step. But importantly, it's these first five stages that have the greatest opportunity to prevent vacancy from actually occurring and to ensure that occupants aren't displaced and that there's some type of interventions that could take place to catch people in the system before they lose their property. And it's really important that communities kind of look at these first five steps and figure out ways to infuse equity in the process with the ultimate goal, again, of ensuring that occupants of properties are not displaced and we're not further creating more vacant properties in our community. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on this today, again, because our purpose is really thinking about those vacant and abandoned properties and ways to transition them to new ownership, but just want to share some questions that you all might want to consider as you're thinking about whether or not your tax sale process is equitable. So first is just understanding how and when are properties assessed and are they accurate and are they fair? We know that there's plenty of information and research out there that says, depending on the population of a particular neighborhood, there's unfair assessments that are happening across the board. So really looking at that at the start of this process is critical. Next are looking to see if there's any type of opportunities for payment plans or deferrals. Kind of at the front end of that, is there exemptions for homeowners? There are opportunities for folks that are struggling financially to receive any type of rebate or opportunity so that they may not be responsible for the full bill, but again, just to keep them in place. Ideally, there are relief programs that your community has. And so part of kind of the equity analysis is really looking at whether those programs are accessible. Is the application process easy to do? Has there been a multifaceted public awareness campaign? Do folks know they could qualify for these various relief programs that might exist? If there is delinquency that has occurred on the property, is there notice given early in the process before a huge amount of debt is accumulated? Is it understandable? And is it done so in terms of according to constitutional standards? And are there other types of supports in the communities that can be provided to folks that are facing financial hardship so that they don't lose their home? Legal assistance, legal aid, things of that nature to, again, ensure that folks that are caught up are being supported before there's an enforcement mechanism that ultimately takes ownership away from those folks. So when we're talking about, again, the vacant and abandoned properties, the key step is this enforcement step. And in an ideal world, if we designed the system properly with equity at the forefront, the properties that kind of get to this enforcement step would be vacant, abandoned. They might be owned by a speculative owner that, is not taking care of it, or an owner that has completely walked away from the property. So this illustrates the basic steps of that delinquent property tax enforcement properties. So the property owner does not pay the taxes. There can be some penalties and interest that accrued on the property and ultimately a lien on the property. Then considering property taxes are a first priority lien, meaning they must be paid before other liens such as mortgages, Local government holds the ultimate control over whether or not it can foreclose on that lien due to the delinquent taxes and acquire the properties. If it does that, notice is given to owners and interested parties, and there's an opportunity for those folks to redeem that property, meaning they would pay back any and all of the penalties, interest, and ultimately the public debt that's accrued on that property. And then there would be an enforcement event that occurs. Either the property itself is sold or the debt is sold and transferred for collection. So this enforcement event is key, and this is where it starts to get really tricky. So I shared there's 50 states across the country. They all have different systems. Those systems could look different county to county and city to city. This is especially true in New York State, which is where I live. So in reality, there are hundreds of different ways the enforcement mechanism could look in communities across the country. But at the risk of kind of oversimplifying it and trying to provide a baseline explanation, we typically break these two systems up into selling the debt and selling the dirt. So when a community is selling the debt, that's when they sell the tax lien or certificate. And the primary goal of this is to collect the debt that is owed, and it's sold to a tax lien investor. And if that tax lien investor is not paid back, they typically have the ability to foreclose on that property or compel the transfer of it. Though we'll speak in a slide or two about how that typically doesn't happen. In contrast, communities that are not selling the lien or the right to collect on the debt, instead they're selling the property. And we call that selling the dirt. You're selling the physical property and land and all of that. And in this enforcement mechanism, typically there's some redemption beforehand, ideally in a public auction that leads to that property being transferred. Now, in some states and jurisdictions, they allow both. And local governments and whoever's the foreclosing governmental entity can make a decision about what approach that they take. In either system, the ideal goal is to collect the taxes, whatever public debt is owed, to the municipality for things like nuisance abatement and such. So that collection is the goal of both of these systems, but the difference is really in terms of the timing and the predictability. So a tax lien sale typically gets those revenues up front, but you can't control then the outcome of that property moving forward, and you can't control the transfer of that property. Selling the dirt, the goal is still the same, to collect the debts and fees that are owed to the municipality, but it's done so at the stage of the auction, assuming that property is sold. So I mentioned our publication authored by our colleague Kim Graziani. There's a really helpful infographic in that kind of goes through the difference between the tax lien sale and a public auction of the property in greater detail, and like what could happen when the government retains the lien and some of the options that they have for auction versus when the government kind of transfers that lien to another entity. And you'll hear from us, probably already have, Community Progress has a really strong preference for selling the dirt, especially for vacant and abandoned properties. Kind of going back to that earlier slide, time is the worst enemy of vacant properties, and the best way to deal with them is to transfer them as swiftly as possible to a new responsible owner to prevent further deterioration and further harm. There are common myths about why tax lien sales might be better. Two that we hear often is that they bring in more revenue and that investors take ownership to the property. So it ultimately could lead to a transfer of ownership. And we've done quite a bit of research to just share back that that's typically not the case. Our research in Rochester, New York, and Baltimore, Maryland did not find any conclusive evidence that the tax lien sale was a way to maximize public revenue. We know it's important for local governments to kind of get that revenue up front. So we don't want to minimize that. And when local governments are making decisions on tax lien versus, selling the dirt. But what we have found, really resounding in a lot of communities that we work with, that while that tax lien is sold and local government might be getting that money, that there's still a lot of expenses that local governments are incurring related to that property, especially if it's vacant and abandoned. So they're giving away their authority to foreclose and deal with that property, but local governments are often still mowing the lawn. They are still addressing nuisance issues, maybe even doing demolition. So thousands of dollars, potentially tens of thousands of dollars are being invested in these properties. And over the long run, that costs more money. Um, we've also done some research. Some of my colleagues found that in a survey in Maryland, there's very few interest in actually owning the properties from tax lien investors. They see this as a financial opportunity to collect the debts and any fees and interest that they might have, but don't really generally have an interest in actually owning the property. So again, this informal survey of counties across Maryland found that 0.001% of the tax lien investors actually foreclosed on the owner's right to redeem of that property and took ownership. So these properties are continuing to sit and stuck, causing more harm to communities. So we talked a little bit about determining if your tax sale system was equitable. We're going to talk about whether or not it's effective and some questions that you all might want to be asking within your local jurisdiction. So first is making sure that local governments are maximizing the payments so that getting what is owed to you, not just the taxes, but any type of abatement and other interventions that have been applied on the property, and also ensuring that there's equitable off ramps so that folks that might be stuck in this system and in an enforcement event, there's opportunities for them to enter those payment plans or other arrangements with the local government so that they don't lose their home. The next is it selling the dirt or selling the debt? Again, huge proponents that selling the dirt is the most effective way to address vacant and abandoned properties through the tax sale system. And does it ultimately result in a transfer of title that is insurable and marketable? Has there been notice provided to all of the owners and interested parties by mailings and postings and publication that would then lead a title insurance company to feel comfortable insuring that property? Is the process transparent? Do folks understand what is happening along the way? Again, just by nature, delinquent tax enforcement is complicated, but are there educational tools and resources that could be provided to folks to better understand it? And is there a process to vet purchasers? So, in many jurisdictions, they can require that bidders register prior to the sale within a certain period of time, and then local governments can disqualify bidders based on certain factors, whether they already have delinquent property taxes or delinquent code liens, or they've had rental licenses revoked in the past, as an attempt to stop and prevent bad actors from taking advantage of the tax sale system and ultimately taking advantage of our communities. Next is thinking about whether the property tax sale system is efficient. So, are all of the public costs included in that redemption amount that's going to be required in order for somebody to not lose their property and it being transferred? Are there duplicative processes that are costing time and money? We know that there could be, it's an administrative burden, some process. And so just really looking at it from that frame of, are we doing everything in the most efficient manner? And is there an opportunity to expedite vacant and abandoned properties through the process to make it quicker and simpler to, again, speed up that time of that transfer? Okay. And so, through our work in communities all across the country, we've found that the most effective and efficient process to get vacant properties through this tax sale system and into new ownership is through a judicial in rem tax foreclosure process. And this includes imposing the liability and the tax debt against the property and not against the owner. It is a process that is supervised by a court. It requires mailed notices that meet due process, results in that property being transferred, which ensure insurable title, which is a really critical step in the new owner being able to do anything with that property and invest money in it and bring it back into the use and a condition that we all want to see. And that the process is ultimately overseen and reviewed and approved by a court. So before I turn it over to my colleague Matt, I just want to end by saying that the delinquent tax enforcement process critical tool, but it also needs to be tied in with a comprehensive approach to addressing vacant and abandoned properties. And so you've likely seen this infographic in some of our other work. It's a fix it up, pay it up, give it an approach. It includes tying in activities related to code enforcement and abatement activities with delinquent tax enforcement, and then ultimately land banking if there's a need for a public steward of those properties at the end of the day. So encourage you all to take a look at some of our other work, especially the Reimagining Code Enforcement report, to just better understand how this delinquent tax enforcement system fits within the larger process and a comprehensive approach to addressing vacancy. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate it. All right. Well, I'm going to get some started out here. We'll get to some of those questions at the end. I've seen a couple of them popping up here and there. But I think what we're going to talk about for now is reform, right? So what if your system doesn't meet some of those requirements, right? What if the tax enforcement system isn't achieving some of those objectives that Liz was just talking about, or you're having other challenges? And I just accidentally advanced to this slide in a minute, which we'll talk about in just a second. So we're going to talk about what we've been seeing, particularly over the last few years, a little bit, and give you some examples, right? But also, to also understand, this is a 101 webinar, right? This is a seriously complex system with a whole lot of moving pieces, and tax foreclosure looks different in all 50 states, right? And then within each of those states, it looks different from many jurisdictions to jurisdictions, right? So there's hundreds of different delinquent tax enforcement types of systems across the country. And so, certainly what we're trying to do here is boil it down to larger principles of reform, how you can look at this, and why it's important, particularly for vacant and abandoned properties. But we also can't forget that when we make reforms to these systems, it also touches occupied properties, right? And it's arguably a much more important and critical piece of this system too. So we'll be talking a little bit about this and this. But if you want further follow-up and something that's a little bit more specific to your individual state or jurisdiction, please feel free to reach out to us. Now, as we talk about reform, we can't talk about reform over the last few years without also acknowledging the Supreme Court's role, the U.S. Supreme Court's role in helping to shape what tax reform is look like. And in fact, not just to shape, but to push for tax reform in different states. And so historically, the federal courts had stayed out of individual state jurisdictions, and putting too many guidelines other than making sure that due process was provided in the tax foreclosure scheme. But over in 2023, the Supreme Court said, actually, hold on, there are some situations where if you are foreclosing on your property tax debt, you have to provide an opportunity for property owners to recover any value in the property or any proceeds in the property or worth in the property that exceeds the total amount of taxes and other public debts that are owed, right? The failure to return those excess proceeds is an unconstitutional taking in violation of the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, right? So that's a really important factor, particularly for those states that have what we call strict foreclosure, where they foreclosed on it, things like that. Now, a lot of what we're going to be talking about in terms of reform keeps that court ruling in mind. I'm not going to get into in-depth about the Tyler versus Hennepin case. There's a lot of materials that we put out on our website that talk about that. But it's an important case to be mindful of, and I'll point you to our policy brief on that recently so you can learn more about it. One other quick note, this is, of course, just something for folks to keep aware. It does look like the Supreme Court in its next term will be taking up the issue of property tax foreclosure again. They granted petitioners writ for certiorari in a case called Pung versus Isabella County, Michigan, right? They will be looking again at some of these issues. We don't know what the outcomes of those right now are, but it's just something that folks should be aware of, that, you know, perhaps next spring or early summer, we'll again see the Supreme Court sort of wade into some of these issues. That said, as we look at all of these issues, right, as we look at all of these things, like what are some of the guiding principles that should guide our efforts for reform? Number one, and I said this earlier, it touches occupied properties, but we don't want our system to be so extractive that we're pulling people out or kicking people out of their home. Like, we need to keep people in their homes, right, to the best extent that we can. And I'll talk about that in just a second. And the second part of that is what Liz was really talking about, which is we still need to use this system as best we can to address the vacant and abandoned deteriorated properties next door to the people that are going to stay in those homes, right? So we'll start first with those concepts about keeping people in their homes. So what does that look like, right? We want to be very, very cognizant of how taxes, particularly when those are high taxes, play out in lower income communities or overtaxed communities. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that a lot of communities that are lower income or communities of color, there's some studies out of Chicago, right, that show that those communities are often historically over-assessed, particularly when compared to other communities or more wealthier communities within the same geographic area, right? So we need to make sure that those assessments are fair and accurate, and sensitive to the market realities in the historical context. We need to increase property tax exemptions, adopt readily accessible circuit breakers, right? So if we do go down this path, we do assess these taxes, people miss those taxes, like how can we sort of break them out of that circuit? And then finally, allowing for things like payment plans. Not a single one of those things is going to solve it. And so it's going to be a package of a whole lot of things trying to figure out how we mitigate any of those challenges and the vulnerability of some of those lower income families that are affected. Another key aspect of this is we've got a lot of properties out there, and there's been a lot more attention in the last few years paid to heirs property, which is a term that a lot of folks use to refer to when an owner passes away and they own that property, but there are no actual steps taken to make sure that their surviving family members actually have a recorded deed or title to it. And sometimes that can happen over generations. It increases the title. It puts a cloud on the title. It makes it harder for them to get loans. It makes it harder for them to secure financing, qualify for property tax relief, which is a big one. So we should be looking at our systems and thinking through how we can ensure that those families are driven towards the things they need to be doing, but also can potentially qualify for some of the relief programs that are needed to save that property from vacancy and or foreclosure. Looking at reducing interest rates payments can be really helpful as another thing. And then ultimately, and this goes to the Tyler versus Hennepin County case, making sure that if folks who do end up losing their properties through this process or have walked away, right, simply because they just can't afford it anymore, can have a clear and accessible process to claim any excess proceeds that they might be due as a result of a tax foreclosure case, right? That process has to be, it can't be overly complex and make it really hard to do it. It's got to be accessible, right? So what's a good example, right? A practice spotlight we'll take a look at really quickly in Washtenaw County. The Washtenaw County treasurer, the former Washtenaw County treasurer, worked very closely with the probate court judge and a whole lot of other folks to put in place this Homes for Generations program, right? They designed the program to assist these families that were living in some of these inherited homes. It connects the descendants of these deceased owners with pro bono legal help and works with families to establish clear title, allowing homeowners access to tax code entitlements, financing, and other benefits of homeownership, right? So it's a really clever program and something worth checking out. All right. But moving on to sort of the bulk of it, and I'll keep this quick to get to some of the examples here, is this second piece of it. We keep people in their homes, sure, but how do we address the vacant and abandoned next door? Now, Liz kind of outlined one of the ways that we believe that system should be done. We talked about judicial in rem. And by the way, in rem just means against the property. So when you file a foreclosure lawsuit, essentially you're filing it against the property and not necessarily against the individual owner. It's kind of a tough concept to talk through. If you have further questions, we can try to address those at a later point. So what are some of the ways that equity can drive reform, right? In this bad property and tax foreclosure, right? So how can we do this? We can shorten the time frame, right? We put in redemption periods because we want to allow homeowners to stay in their homes. So sometimes that's 2 years, 3 years, sometimes more, right? We give them time to sort of get caught up. But for vacant properties are already vacant and go into this system, we can shorten that time frame, right? We can put in place separate standards to make sure that we push this property through that system and get it into the hands of a new owner, hopefully at a shorter period of time, right? Really a critical piece to that. As Liz talked about earlier, selling the dirt, not the debt, right? When you sell the debt, you sell that debt and the right to collect the debt. And while a lot of jurisdictions view that as a helpful way to sort of get some upfront payments to finance, essential services, when we do that, we have some complicated issues that Liz already kind of talked through at the end of the day. Providing judicial oversight and constitutional notice to ensure clear title. This is sort of the crux of so much of this, right? If we push these properties through and we don't make sure that all the boxes are checked and we give people confidence that those boxes were checked through judicial oversight, for example, and if we don't provide that constitutional notice, then what we get on the opposite side is a property that's gone through the system and it really is only available to a smaller fraction of potential buyers, right? Only a few people, probably a much more limited pool of folks, have the capacity to be able to buy a piece of property from this and then go spend a whole bunch of additional dollars to go clear the title to it, right? To go do all that research, hire a lawyer, and try to clear the title on some of these pieces of property. If we can do that all as part of one system, it's a lot more efficient, and it also opens up the pool of potential buyers that might be able to participate in certain markets. And finally, if we push a vacant and abandoned property through this system, right, and we provide all of these things, there's always going to be a subset of properties, not always, but in many jurisdictions, obviously rising housing markets in a lot of communities impact this, but there's going to be a subset of properties that simply at the amount of the public debt are going to be more than somebody in the market is willing to pay. Right. And so we need to have a place to ensure that those don't continue to linger. And so the local governments or land banks and whatever responsible entity is there should be around, right? It should be able to, do some kind of a credit bid or a bid at that price in the amount that's owed, right? In case there are no additional bidders, to be able to take ownership of that property and do what they can then to work with a community of maybe it's local developers or maybe it's making it available for first-time home buyers or whatever, to try to reactivate that property and put it back to the best possible public use. And it may not be home ownership, right? It may be something along the lines of it may be needed for, a park or an open space type of plan or something like that. So here's just a couple of very quick examples of some recent reforms that have been done. The first one is in Missouri, and I want to give a huge shout out to the partners in Missouri. Huge coalition of folks that have helped to pass this there. Their work has been incredible. There's, certainly Legal Services of Eastern Missouri has played a role. There are folks in St. Louis County, folks in St. Louis City, the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative, and of course my colleagues or former colleagues, Libby Benton, Sarah Toring, others have helped to really educate and help those partners sort of adopt some reforms. And so in 2024, Missouri passed House Bill 2062. It gives those communities two new tools. It allows counties to opt out of the tax lien sale foreclosure process and use a court-supervised process designed hopefully to better protect homeowners and more quickly address those problem properties. It also allows Missouri municipalities and St. Louis County to create land banks. The land banks will be able to receive tax foreclosed properties that don't get a bid. and focus on returning those properties to productive use. It draws on a lot of lessons that were already learned from Missouri partners and existing land banks in Kansas City and St. Louis and other places. Shout out to Representative Kevin Windham, who helped to form the coalition, and Representative in 2022, and Representative Bill Owen, who was a longtime land bank champion and introduced that bipartisan legislation and brought it across the finish line. Right. Throughout that process, coalition leaders focused on a whole lot of things. And so one of the things that was most helpful, Liz, I don't know if you want to play this video that they made at this point. Sorry, we're going to try to give you all a video that the folks made to sort of educate folks in Missouri on why some of this legislation was so important.
Here. It's my first time sharing a video with sound, guys, so appreciate your patience. Open that little there.
Exploring some St. Louis neighborhoods, one thing is immediately noticeable: vacant houses. Lots and lots of vacant houses. This isn't a new problem, and like many problems in St. Louis, it's rooted in racism. A long history of segregation and discrimination means that over 90% of vacant houses are in majority Black communities. Vacant homes make neighbors feel frustrated and unsafe. They lower surrounding property values and make communities less desirable to potential buyers, leading to a vicious cycle of decline. The problem is made worse by St. Louis County's property tax sales system, where tax-delinquent properties are put up for auction. And unless we make some important changes, things aren't going to get better. Meet Terry and Tiana. They're looking to buy a vacant house in their neighborhood and fix it up. They check out the county's tax sale list, where properties that didn't sell at tax auction await potential buyers. They notice a house on their block is on the list, but as they looked more closely, they discovered the property has been on the list for years and has back taxes that they'd have to pay off. More tax debt than the property is even worth. Plus, their realtor tells them that if they buy a house from the county's tax sale list, the title would most likely have defects. What's this mean? Under the current system, previous owners may not have been warned to pay their taxes or risk losing their property. These warnings are called legal notice, and they are constitutionally required before you take someone's property. When that legal notice doesn't go out, title defects form. So they'd have to hire a lawyer to fix the title defects, which could take a year and cost a few $1,000s. Terry and Tiana decide the numbers don't work out and walk away. The house continues to sit vacant, no one pays the taxes, and the vicious cycle continues. St. Louis County needs a better system to get properties ready for rehab. There's a simple equation to get us there: a judicial tax sale system plus land banking. By choosing a judicial tax sale system, a court would supervise the sale, protecting property owners' rights and ensuring that the tax sale buyer purchases that property free and clear of any liens or title defects. But what about the properties that don't sell at auction? The ones where the tax debt is more than the value of the property? There's actually a solution being used all over the country to solve this exact problem: land banking.
Thank you, Liz. If you could pull up the presentation again, I'll just keep talking through it. I think that video it's a little bit longer, but it's not much longer, which is really important, and I think was really important to those folks. But it was a really helpful tool in starting to educate folks around the state as to why was this all so important, right? What was great about it? This is a ridiculously complex system, and I live in Illinois and can attest to the complexity of it here, and in many other states that we've worked. So hopefully that tool is instructive for a lot of other folks. We have the link and we'll make that available as well too. Next. Go. West Virginia also in 2022 enacted a number of not so massive provisions, but some smart provisions, right, that really do help to result it. They did some stuff that helps to increase the time between tax delinquency and the tax lien sale. They lowered the post-tax lien sale redemption period for vacant properties to expedite the transfer to a new owner. They eliminated with a secondary tax lien sale, which is pretty inefficient, and created another new entity, the West Virginia Land Stewardship Corporation, to receive those liens that didn't receive bids at the first tax lien sale, right? It's a statewide entity. They've been doing some great work in helping land banks across the state, around brownfields, all kinds of different things. And they're a wonderful organization. It also grants the Stewardship Corporation the authority to sell tax liens at any price, requires the auditor to prioritize residents and local governments in lien disposition, right? So lots of cool things that's able to do. Now, there are a lot of other examples of reform that have happened over the years, particularly reform related to, Tyler versus Hennepin County, things like that. Liz, I don't know if you can move to the next slide. It's not advancing for me. Thank you. Here are some additional publications we've put out. I'm sure there will be more in the near future, particularly given the Supreme Court will be taking up some of these issues again in the future. And we'll be sharing more information as we kind of learn about it and want to educate our constituencies as well. In the meantime, I hope that's just a good example of, a lot of the different kinds of things that folks can do, how we sort of think about it. And I think now we are going to sort of move into the question and answer session. So again, feel free to put those questions in the Q&A. Liz, you want to come back on?
I'm back here. Great. Awesome. Thanks, Matt. So it would be helpful if folks there's a great chat going on. I haven't had an opportunity to look through it all, but if you have questions, transferring them to the Q&A box. So I'm going to read one, Matt. We can start here. So we have a question that says, we're trying to find models on how to capture city and municipal costs for property management and sales when disposing of properties. Are there any models that have worked for that, particularly finding legally defensible averages amongst both vacant lots and improved properties?
That is an excellent question. And I think Liz touched on it too. I didn't touch on it as much as I should have in the reform section, but I think something that we strongly believe, right, is so your point there about trying to capture city or municipal costs for property management or sales and disposing of properties. I think it starts earlier than that, right? It starts when some of these properties start to deteriorate in the first place, right? And code enforcement has to get involved. And maybe there's abatement actions or attempts to try to get the owner to comply, right, with the local standards and things like that. All of that costs money. And all of that should be, to the extent state law allows, captured and added to that public debt that can be collected within this system. Now, you got to do it right? You can't just throw a $30,000 fine on there for not mowing your grass or something like that. There's a whole lot that needs to go into that. But, to the extent that jurisdictions are mowing the grass or removing trash and debris or boarding up the vacant property or going so far as to demolish it, there should be the ability to do that. Likewise, Carrie, to your question, to the extent that the municipality is incurring costs to send notice, to do all those things, to manage properties that are sitting there, or to try and sell properties, those can and should be factored in. I don't have a particular model that works best. And there's some jurisdictions that are attempting to do it right. Michigan reformed its property tax system in 2021 in response to a state case that was very much like the Tyler versus Hennepin County case. And one of the things that they said is, for all the properties, you can come and get your excess proceeds, but if we have to put a property up for sale, there's a cost. And they added in a certain percentage of that property's value that they said was a cost. Whether or not that continues to hold up, I don't know, but it reflects what a lot of jurisdictions are recognizing, which is the more that we go through these processes, the more we have to manage and things like that, the more costs we incur. And to the extent that you can defend those costs, they will try to add those on to whatever that public sale price is. So, or reduce whatever proceeds might be available down the road. Again, you want that to be fair, right? You don't want to completely deprive a former owner, particularly a vulnerable one, of sorely needed equity, but taxpayers are also incurring some fees and stuff too.
Right. So we got a few questions related to the in-rem foreclosure process and how it meets requirements for title insurance companies to insure those properties, and some comments about places in New York, title insurance companies not necessarily supporting or feeling like it's adequate notice. So can you share a little bit more about thoughts there?
Is there a model for compliance with title insurance requirements, essentially? Is that the one we're looking at?
Yes, and in the chat, uh,
Yeah.
similar type of question.
Yeah. So I'm going to get back to Carrie's question too, because I don't think I answered it. There was some clarity there too. But I think that as far as title insurance proceedings, again, it's kind of, the question there was, or the problem there is that apparently title insurance companies are rejecting certain proceedings for judicial foreclosure. I need to know more about the details of that in each situation to be able to answer that question well, right? Due process should require, and the line of cases the U.S. Constitution is often called Mennonite notice. It's a line of cases from the Supreme Court, followed up by a case called Jones versus Flowers, which says that in a tax foreclosure case, you can mail notice, right? But you have to mail notice to all interested parties and any parties who are reasonably ascertainable from the record. And you have to do your due diligence. And if if you get mail back or something like that, you got to follow up. You got to take a look. Obviously, there's a lot more detail to those cases, but so long as you follow the constitutional requirements for providing notice and due process in line with those cases, you should be able, hopefully, to get or secure title insurance. And title insurers, in our understanding of it, they'll look at the process that's in place, and they'll look at the law, and they'll look both, does the law require, the minimum constitutional standards? Does the law meet those? And they'll also look at, do they actually think that's actually happening? Is the county or the foreclosing local government entity actually providing constitutionally minimum due process? And so I think you got to look at both of those things within that jurisdiction when you're asking the question. But the easiest way is to go talk to them, right? And to try to figure this out. And when you're doing reform, highly recommend you engage your local title insurance companies in that process and understand better what it is they're looking for. What are the challenges they've had with the current system or the past system? And how could that statutory scheme and framework and the practice of providing notice improve in order to gain title insurance? And I'm sorry, Carrie, I know you'd said in your recapture, so you're only struggling with the costs after acquisition. I'm afraid I don't have a ton of time right now to sort of brainstorm the Julie, are you taking me off?
Finish your sentence, but yeah.
Yeah. No, okay. I was just going to say I don't have enough time to brainstorm that right off the bat because I'm not sure I fully understand the question. But if you want to reach out separately, be happy to do so.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for joining today and for your great questions. We will be sending a recording and the presentation slides within the next week, along with any of the resources we've shared. I just dropped a link to a survey in the chat for you to share your experience with the webinar and help us improve in the future. Thanks so much, everyone.